Chapter 31. For at least half a minute, I fumbled at the door in the dark, feeling for the handle. Then, I slowly opened it and walked into the drawing room. Zinaida Fyodorovna was lying on the couch, and raising herself from her elbow, she looked towards me. Unable to bring myself to speak, I walked slowly by, and she followed me with her eyes. I stood for a little time in the dining room and then walked by her again, and she looked at me intently and with perplexity, even with alarm. At last, I stood still and said, with an effort, "He's not coming back." She quickly got onto her feet and looked at me without understanding. "He is not coming back," I repeated, and my heart beat violently. "He will not come back, for he has not left Petersburg. He's staying at Pekarski's." She understood and believed me. I saw that from her sudden pallor, and from the way she laid her arms upon her bosom, in terror and entreaty. In one instant, all that had happened of late flashed through her mind. She reflected, and with pitiless clarity, she saw the whole truth. But at the same time, she remembered that I was a flunky, a being of a lower order, a casual stranger, with hair ruffled, with face flushed with fever, perhaps drunk, in a common overcoat, was coarsely intruding into her intimate life, and that offended her. She said to me sternly, "It's not your business. Go away." "Oh, believe me." I cried impetuously, holding out my hands to her. "I am not a footman. I am as free as you." I mentioned my name, and speaking very rapidly, that she might not interrupt me or go away, explained to her who I was and why I was living there. This new discovery struck her more than the first. Till then, she had hoped that her footman had lied or made a mistake or been silly. But now, after my confession, she had no doubts left. From the expression of her unhappy eyes and face, which suddenly lost its softness and beauty and looked old, I saw that she was insufferably miserable, and that the conversation would lead to no good. But I went on impetuously. "The senator and the tour of inspection were invented to deceive you. In January, just as now, he did not go away, but stayed at Pekarski's. And I saw him every day and took part in the deception. He was weary of you. He hated your presence here. He mocked at you. If you could have heard how he and his friends here jeered at you and your love, you would not have remained here 1 minute. Go away from here. Go away." "Well," she said in a shaking voice, and moved her hand over her hair. "Well, so be it." Her eyes were full of tears, her lips were quivering, and her whole face was strikingly pale and distorted with anger. Orlov's coarse, petty lying revolted her and seemed to her contemptible, ridiculous. She smiled, and I did not like that smile. "Well," she repeated, passing her hand over her hair again, "so be it." He imagines that I shall die of humiliation. And instead of that, I am amused by it. There's no need for him to hide. She walked away from the piano and said, shrugging her shoulders, "There's no need. It would have been simpler to have it out with me instead of keeping it hiding in other people's flats. I have eyes. I saw it myself long ago. I was only waiting for him to come back to have things out once for all." Then she sat down on a low chair by the table and, leaning her head on the arm of the sofa, wept bitterly. In the drawing room, there was only one candle burning in the candelabra, and the chair where she was sitting was in darkness. But I saw how her head and shoulders were quivering, and how her hair, escaping from her combs, covered her neck, her face, her arms. Her quiet, steady weeping, which was not hysterical, but a woman's ordinary weeping, expressed a sense of insult, of wounded pride, of injury, and of something helpless, hopeless, which one could not set right, and to which one could not get used. Her tears stirred an echo in my troubled and suffering heart. I forgot my illness and everything else in the world. I walked about the drawing room and muttered distractedly, "Is this life? Oh, one can't go on living like this. One can't." Oh, it's madness, wickedness, not life. What humiliation, she said through her tears. To live together, to smile at me at the very time when I was burdensome to him, ridiculous in his eyes. Oh, how humiliating. She lifted up her head and, looking at me with tear-stained eyes through her hair, wet with her tears, and pushing it back as it prevented her seeing me, she asked, "They laughed at me? To these men, you were laughable, you and your love and Turgenev. They said your head was full of him. And if we both die at once in despair, that will amuse them too. They will make a funny anecdote of it and tell it at your requiem service. But why talk of them?" Or said impatiently, "We must get away from here. I can't stay here 1 minute longer." She began crying again while I walked to the piano and sat down. "What are we waiting for?" I asked dejectedly. "It's 2 o'clock. I am not waiting for anything," she said. "I am utterly lost." "Why do you talk like that?" "We had better consider together what we are to do. Neither you nor I can stay here. Where do you intend to go?" Suddenly, there was a ring at the bell. My heart stood still. Could it be Orlov, to whom perhaps Kukushkin had complained of me? How should we meet? I went to open the door. It was Polya. She came in shaking the snow off her pelisse and went into her room without saying a word to me. When I went back to the drawing room, Zinaida Fyodorovna pale as death, was standing in the middle of the room, looking towards me with big eyes. Who was it? She asked softly. Parlia, I answered. She passed her hand over her hair and closed her eyes wearily. I will go away at once, she said. Will you be kind and take me to the Petersburg side? What time is it now? 2:45. Chapter 32. When, a little afterwards, we went out of the house, it was dark and deserted in the street. Wet snow was falling, and the damp wind lashed in one's face. I remember it was the beginning of March. A thaw had set in, and for some days past the cabman had been driving on wheels. Under the impression of the back stairs, of the cold, of the midnight darkness, and the porter in his sheepskin who had questioned us before letting us out of the gate, Zinaida Fyodorovna was utterly cast down and dispirited. When we got into the cab and the hood was put up, trembling all over, she began hurriedly saying how grateful she was to me. I do not doubt your goodwill, but I am ashamed that you should be troubled, she muttered. Oh, I understand. I understand. When Gersing was here today, I felt that he was lying and concealing something. Well, so be it. But I am ashamed, anyway, that you should be troubled. She still had her doubts. To dispel them finally, I asked a cabman to drive through Sergeyevsky Street. Stopping him at Akarsky's door, I got out of the cab and ran. When the porter came to the door, I asked aloud that Zinaida Fyodorovna might hear whether Georgy Ivanitch was at home. Yes, was the answer. He came in half an hour ago. He must be in bed by now. What do you want? Zinaida Fyodorovna could not refrain from putting her head out. So, has Georgy Ivanitch been staying here long? She asked. Going on for 3 weeks, and he's not been away. No, answered the porter, looking at me with surprise. Tell him early tomorrow, I said, that his sister has arrived from Warsaw. Goodbye. Goodbye. Then we drove on. The cab had no apron. The snow fell on us in big flakes, and the wind, especially on the Neva, pierced us through and through. I began to feel as though we had been driving for a long time, that for ages we had been suffering, and that for ages I had been listening to Zinaida Fyodorovna's shuddering breath. In semi-delirium, as though half asleep, I looked back upon my strange, incoherent life, and for some reason recalled the melodrama, The Parisian Beggars, which I had seen once or twice in my childhood. And when to shake off that sunny delirium, I peeped out from the hood and saw the dawn. All the images of the past, all my misty thoughts, for some reason, blended in me into one distinct, overpowering thought. Everything was irrevocably over for Zinaida Fyodorovna and for me. This was as certain a conviction as though the cold blue sky contained a prophecy. But a minute later, I was already thinking of something else and believed differently. What am I now? Said Zinaida Fyodorovna in a voice husky with the cold and the damp. Where am I to go? What am I to do? Prison told me to go into a nunnery. Oh, I would. I would change my dress, my face, my name, my thoughts, everything, and would hide myself forever. But they will not take me into a nunnery. I am with child, and we will go abroad together tomorrow, I said. That's impossible. My husband won't give me a passport. I will take you without a passport. The cabman stopped at a wooden house of 2 stories painted a dark color. I rang, taking from me her small white basket, the only luggage we had brought with us. Zinaida Fyodorovna gave a wry smile and said, "These are my bijoux." But she was so weak that she could not carry these bijoux. It was a long while before the door was open. After the 3rd or 4th ring, a light gleamed in the windows, and there was a sound of steps, coughing and whispering. At last, the key grated in the lock, and a stout peasant woman with a frightened red face appeared at the door. Some distance behind her stood a thin little old woman with short gray hair, carrying a candle in her hand. Zinaida Fyodorovna ran into the passage and flung her arms round the old woman's neck. "Nina, I've been deceived," she sobbed loudly. "I've been coarsely, foully deceived. Nina, Nina." I handed the basket to the peasant woman. The door was closed, but still I heard her sobs and the cry Nina. I got into the cab and told the man to drive slowly to the Nevsky Prospect. I had to think of a night's lodging for myself. Next day, towards evening, I went to see Zinaida Fyodorovna. She was terribly changed. There were no traces of tears on her pale, terribly sunken face, and her expression was different. I don't know whether it was that I saw her, now in different surroundings, far from luxurious, and that our relations were by now different, or perhaps that intense grief had already set its mark upon her. She did not strike me as so elegant and well-dressed as before. Her figure seemed smaller. There was an abruptness and excessive nervousness about her, as though she were in a hurry. And there was not the same softness even in her smile. I was dressed in an expensive suit which I had bought during the day. She looked first of all at that suit and at the hat in my hand, then turned an impatient, searching glance upon my face, as though studying it. "Your transformation still seems to me a sort of miracle," she said. Forgive me for looking at you with such curiosity. You are an extraordinary man, you know. I told her again who I was and why I was living at Orlov's. And I told her at greater length and in more detail than the day before. She listened with great attention and said, without letting me finish, everything there is over for me. You know, I could not refrain from writing a letter. Here's the answer. On the sheet which she gave there was written in Orlov's hand. I am not going to justify myself, but you must own that it was your mistake, not mine. You need to use them, as mother as you are, as you know what else. Yours sincerely, Gops. I am sending on your things. The trunks and baskets dispatched by Orlov were standing in the passage. My poor little portmanteau was there beside them. So, Zinaida Fyodorovna began, but she did not finish. We were silent. She took the note and held it for a couple of minutes before her eyes. And during that time, her face wore the same haughty, contemptuous, proud, and harsh expression as the day before at the beginning of our explanation. Tears came into her eyes, not timid, bitter tears, but proud, angry tears. Listen, she said, getting up abruptly and moving away to the window that I might not see her face. I have made up my mind to go abroad with you tomorrow. I am very glad. I am ready to go today. Accept me as a recruit. Have you read Balzac? She asked, suddenly turning round. Have you? At the end of his novel Paragorio, the hero looks down upon Paris from the top of a hill and threatens the town. Now we shall settle our account. And after this, he begins a new life. So when I look out of the train window at Petersburg for the last time, I shall say, now we shall settle our account. Saying this, she smiled at her jest, and for some reason shuddered all over. Chapter 33. At Venice, we had an attack of pleurisy. Venice? Probably I had caught cold in the evening when we were rowing from the station to the Hotel Bauer. I had to take to my bed and stay there for a fortnight. Every morning while I was ill, Zinaida Fyodorovna came from her room to drink coffee with me, and afterwards read aloud to me French and Russian books, of which we had bought a number at Vienna. These books were either long familiar to me or else had no interest for me. But I had the sound of a sweet, kind voice beside me, so that the meaning of all of them was summed up for me in the one thing: I was not alone. She would go out for a walk, come back in her light gray dress, her light straw hat, gay, warmed by the spring sun. And sitting by my bed, bending low down over me, would tell me something about Venice or read me those books, and I was happy. At night I was cold, ill, and dreary, But by day, I reveled in life. I can find no better expression for it. The brilliant, warm sunshine beating in at the open windows and at the door upon the balcony. The shots below, the splash of oars, the tinkle of bells, the prolonged boom of the cannon at midday, and the feeling of perfect freedom did wonders with me. I felt as though I were growing strong, broad wings, which were bearing me God knows whither. And what charm, what joy at times, at the thought that another life was so close to mine. That I was the servant, the guardian, the friend, the indispensable fellow traveler of a creature, young, beautiful, wealthy, but weak, lonely, and insulted. It is pleasant, even to be ill, when you know that. There are people who are looking forward to your convalescence as to a holiday. One day, I heard her whispering behind the door with my doctor, and then she came in to me with tear-stained eyes. It was a bad sign, but I was touched, and there was a wonderful lightness in my heart. But at last, they allowed me to go out on the balcony. The sunshine and the breeze from the sea caressed and fondled my sick body. I looked down at the familiar gondolas, which glide with feminine grace smoothly and majestically as though they were alive, and felt all the luxury of this original, fascinating civilization. There was a smell of the sea. Someone was playing a stringed instrument, and two voices were singing. How delightful it was. How unlike it was to that Petersburg night, when the wet snow was falling and beating so rudely on our faces. If one looks straight across the canal, one sees the sea, and on the wide expanse towards the horizon, the sun glittered on the water, so dazzlingly that it hurt one's eyes to look at it. My soul yearned towards that lovely sea, which was so akin to me, into which I had given up my youth. I longed to live, and nothing more. A fortnight later, I began walking freely. I loved to sit in the sun and to listen to the gondoliers without understanding them, and for hours together to gaze at the little house where, they said, Desdemona lived, a naive, mournful little house with a demure expression. As light as lace, so light that it looked as though one could lift it from its place with one hand. I stood for a long time by the tomb of Canova and could not take my eyes off the melancholy lion. And in the palace of the Doge, I was always drawn to the corner where the portrait of the unhappy Marino Faliero was painted over with plaque. It's fine to be an artist, a poet, a dramatist, I thought. But since that is not vouchsafed to me, if only I could go in for mysticism. If only I had a grain of some faith to add to the unruffled peace and serenity that fills the soul. In the evening, we ate oysters, drank wine, and went out in a gondola. I remember our black gondola swayed softly in the same place, while the water faintly gurgled under it. Here and there, the reflection of the stars and the lights on the bank quivered and trembled. Not far from us in a gondola, hung with colored lanterns which were reflected in the water, there were people singing. The sounds of guitars, of violins, of mandolins, of men's and women's voices were audible in the dark. Zinaida Fyodorovna, pale, with a grave, almost stern face, was sitting beside me, compressing her lips and clenching her hands. She was thinking about something. She did not stir an eyelash, nor hear me. Her face, her attitude, and her fixed, expressionless gaze, and her incredibly miserable, dreadful, and icy cold memories. And around her, the gondolas, the lights, the music, the song, with its vigorous, passionate cry of Jammo. Jammo, what contrasts in life. When she sat like that, with tightly clasped hands, stony, mournful, I used to feel as though we were both characters in some novel, in the old-fashioned style called the ill-fated, the abandoned, or something of the sort. Both of us. She, the ill-fated, the abandoned. And I, the faithful, devoted friend, the dreamer. And if you like it, a superfluous man, a failure capable of nothing but coughing and dreaming, and perhaps sacrificing myself. But who and what needed my sacrifices now? And what had I to sacrifice, indeed? When we came in the evening, we always drank tea in her room and talked. We did not after reels, not trees head as sit at our work to each other, or not safely is stated in the contrary. For some reason, I felt a positive pleasure in telling her about my life at Olov's, or referring openly to relations which I knew, and which could not have been concealed from me. At moments, I hated you, I said to her. When he was capricious, condescending, told you lies, I marveled how it was you did not see, did not understand, when it was all so clear. You kissed his hands, you knelt to him, you flattered him. When I kissed his hands and knelt to him, I loved him. She said, blushing crimson. It had been so difficult to see through him. A fine sphinx. A sphinx indeed. A camera junker. I reproach you for nothing. God forbid, I went on, feeling I was coarse, but I had not the tact, the delicacy, which are so essential when you have to do with a fellow creature's soul. In early days before I knew her, I had not noticed this defect in myself. But how could you fail to see what he was? I went on, speaking more softly and more diffidently, however. You mean to say you despise my past? And you are right, she said, deeply stirred. You belong to a special class of men who cannot be judged by ordinary standards. Your moral requirements are exceptionally rigorous. And I understand you can't forgive things. I understand you. And if sometimes I say the opposite, it doesn't mean that I look at things differently from you. I speak the same old nonsense, simply because I haven't had time yet to wear out my old clothes and prejudices. I, too, hate and despise my past, and Orloff, and my love. What was that love? It's positively absurd now, she said, going to the window and looking down at the canal. All this love only clouds the conscience and confuses the mind. The meaning of life is to be found only in one thing: fighting. To get one's heel when I dyed the vile head of the serpent and to crush it. That's the meaning of life. In that alone or in nothing. I told her long stories of my past and described my really astounding adventures. But of the change that had taken place in me, I did not say one word. She always listened to me with great attention, and in interesting places she rubbed her hands, as though vexed that it had not yet been her lot to experience such adventures, such joys and terrors. Then she would suddenly fall to musing and retreat into herself, and I could see from her face that she was not attending to me. I closed the windows that looked out on the canal and asked whether we should not have the fire lighted. No, never mind. I am not cold, she said, smiling listlessly. And I only feel weak. You know, I fancy I have grown much wiser lately. I have extraordinary original ideas. When I think of my past, of my life, then people in general, in fact, it is all summed up for me in the image of my stepmother. Coarse, insolent, soulless, false, depraved, and a morphia maniac too. My father, who was feeble and weak-willed, married my mother for her money and drove her into consumption. But his second wife, my stepmother, he loved passionately, insanely. What I had to put up with. But what is the use of talking? And so, as I say, it is all summed up in her image. And it vexes me that my stepmother is dead. I should like to meet her now. Why? I don't know. She answered with a laugh and a graceful movement of her head. Good night. You must get well. As soon as you are well, we'll take up our work. It's time to begin. After I had said good night and had my hand on the door handle, she said, "What do you think? Is Pollia still living there?" "Probably." And I went off to my room. So we spent a whole month. One gray morning, when we both stood at my window, looking at the clouds which were moving up from the sea, and at the darkening canal, expecting every minute that it would pour with rain. And when a thick, narrow streak of rain covered the sea as though with a muslin veil, we both felt suddenly dreary. The same day, we both set off for Florence. Chapter 34. It was autumn at Nice. One morning, when I went into her room, she was sitting on a low chair, bent together and huddled up, with her legs crossed and her face hidden in her hands. She was weeping some bitterly, with sobs, and her long, unbrushed hair fell on her knees. The impression of the exquisite, marvelous sea, which I'd only just seen, and of which I wanted to tell her, left me all at once, and my heart ached. "What is it?" I asked. She took one hand from her face and motioned me to go away. "What is it?" I repeated, and for the first time during our acquaintance. I kissed her hand. "No, it's nothing. Nothing," she said quickly. "Oh, it's nothing. Nothing. Go away. You see, I am not dressed." I went out overwhelmed. The calm and serene mood in which I have been for so long is poisoned by compassion. I had a passionate longing to fall at her feet, to entreat her not to weep in solitude, but to share her grief with me, and the monotonous murmur of the sea already sounded a gloomy prophecy in my ears. And I foresaw fresh tears, fresh troubles, and fresh losses in the future. What is she crying about? What is it? I wondered, recalling her face and her agonized look. I remembered she was with child. She tried to conceal her condition from other people and also from herself. At home, she went about in a loose wrapper or in a blouse with extremely full folds over the bosom. And when she went out anywhere, she laced herself in so tightly that on 2 occasions she fainted when we were out. She never spoke to me of her condition, and when I hinted that it might be as well to see a doctor, she flushed crimson and said not a word. When I went to see her next time, she was already dressed and had her hair done. There, I said, seeing that she was ready to cry again. We had better go to the sea and have a talk. I can't talk. Forgive me. I am in the mood now when one wants to be alone. And if you please, Radomir Ivanitch, another time you want to come into my room, be so good as to give a knock at the door. That "be so good" had a peculiar unfeminine sound. I went away. My accursed Petersburg mood came back, and all my dreams were crushed and crumpled up like leaves by the heat. I felt I was alone again, and there was no nearness between us. I was no more to her than that cobweb to that palm tree which hangs on it by chance and which will be torn off and carried away by the wind. I walked about the square where the band was playing, went into the casino. There I looked at overdressed and heavily perfumed women, and every one of them glanced at me as though she would say, "You are alone? That's all right." Then I went out on the terrace and looked for a long time at the sea. There was not one sail on the horizon. On left bank, on the lilac-colored mist, there were mountains, gardens, towers, and houses. The sun was sparkling over it all, but it was all alien, indifferent, and incomprehensible tangle. Chapter 35. She used, as before, to come into my room in the morning to coffee, but we no longer dined together, as she said she was not hungry. And she went only on coffee, tea, and various trifles, such as oranges and camels. And we no longer had conversations in the evening. I don't know why it was like this. Ever since the day when I had found her in tears, she had treated me somehow lightly, at times casually, even ironically. He for some reason called me "my good sir." What had before seemed to her terrible, heroic, marvelous, and had stirred her envy and enthusiasm, did not touch her now at all. And usually after listening to me, she stretched and said, "Yes, great things were done in days of yore, my good sir. It sometimes happened, even that I did not see her for days together." I would knock timidly and guiltily at her door and get no answer. I would knock. Again, still silence. I would stand near the door and listen. Then the chambermaid would pass and say coldly, "Madame a partie." Then I would walk about the passages of the hotel, walk and walk. English people, full-bosomed ladies, waiters and swallowtails. And as I keep gazing at the long striped rug that stretches the whole length of the corridor, the idea occurs to me that I am playing in the life of this woman, a strange, probably false part, and that it is beyond my power to alter that part. I run to my room and fall on my bed and think and think and can come to no conclusion, and all that is clear to me is that I want to live, and that the plainer and the colder and the harder her face grows, the nearer she is to me, and the more intensely and painfully I feel our kinship. Never mind, my good sir. Never mind her light, careless tone. And never mind anything you like. Only don't leave me, my treasure. I'm afraid to be alone. Then I go out into the corridor again. Listen in a tremor. I have no dinner. I don't notice the approach of evening. At last, about 11, I hear the familiar footstep. And after the turn near the stairs, Zinaida Fyodorovna comes into sight. "Are you taking a walk?" she would ask as she passes me. "You had better go out into the air." "Bydward." But shall we not meet again today? I think it's late. But as you like. Tell me, where have you been? I would ask, following her into the room. Where? To Monte Carlo. She took 10 gold coins out of her pocket and said, Look, my good sir, I have won. That's at roulette. Nonsense. As though you would gamble. Why not? I'm going again tomorrow. I imagined her with a sick and morbid face in her condition, tightly laced, standing near the gaming table, in a crowd of cocottes, of old women in their dotage who swarm round the gold like flies round the honey. I remembered she had gone off to Monte Carlo for some reason in secret from me. I don't believe you, I said one day. You wouldn't go there. Don't agitate yourself. I can't lose much. It's not the question of what you lose, I said with annoyance. Has it never occurred to you while you were playing there that the glitter of gold, all these women, young and old, the croupiers, all the surroundings, that it is all a vile, loathsome mockery at the toiler's labor, at his bloody sweat? If one doesn't play, what is one to do here? She asked. The toiler's labor and his bloody sweat. Now that eloquence you can put off till another time. But now, since you have begun, let me go on. Let me ask you bluntly, what is there for me to do here? And what am I to do? What are you to do? I said, shrugging my shoulders. That's a question that can't be answered straight off. I beg you to answer me honestly, Vladimir Ivanitch. She said, and her face looked angry. Once I've brought myself to ask you this question, I am not going to listen to stock phrases. I am asking you, she went on, beating her hand on the table, as though marking time. What ought I to do here? And not only here at Nice, but in general? I did not speak, but looked out of window to the sea. My heart was beating terribly. Vladimir Ivanitch, she said softly and breathlessly. It was hard for her to speak, Vladimir Ivanitch, if you do not believe in the cause yourself. If you no longer think of going back to it, why? Why did you drag me out of Petersburg? Why did you make me promises? Why did you rouse mad hopes? Your convictions have changed. You have become a different man, and nobody blames you for it. Our convictions are not always in our power. But, Vladimir Ivanitch, for God's sake, why are you not sincere? She went on softly, coming up to me. All these months, when I have been dreaming aloud, raving, going into raptures over my plans, remodeling my life on a new pattern, why didn't you Tell me the truth. Why were you silent or encouraged me by your stories and behaved as though you were in complete sympathy with me? Why was it? Why was it necessary? It's difficult to acknowledge one's bankruptcy, I said, turning round, but not looking at her. Yes, I have no faith. I am worn out. I have lost heart. It is difficult to be truthful, very difficult. And I held my tongue. And God forbid that anyone should have to go through what I had been through. I felt that I was on the point of tears and ceased speaking. Vladimir Ivanitch, she said, and took me by both hands. You have been through so much and seen so much of life. You know more than I do. Think seriously and tell me, what am I to do? Teach me. If you haven't imagined the strength to go forward yourself and take others with you, at least show me where to go. After all, I am a living, feeling, thinking being. To sink into a false position to play an absurd part is painful to me. I don't reproach you. I don't blame you. I only ask you. Tea was brought in. Well, said Zinaida Fyodorovna, giving me a glass. What do you say to me? There is more light in the world than you see through your window, I answered. And there are other people besides me, Zinaida Fyodorovna. Then tell me who they are, she said eagerly. That's all I ask of you. And I want to say too, I went on, one can serve an idea in more than one calling. If one has made a mistake and lost faith in one may find another. The world of ideas is large and cannot be exhausted. The world of ideas, she said, and she looked into my face sarcastically. Then we had better leave off talking. What's the use? She flushed. The world of ideas, she repeated. She threw her dinner, napkin aside, and an expression of indignation and contempt came into her face. All your fine ideas, I see, lead up to one inevitable, essential step. To become your mistress. That's what's wanted. To be taken up with ideas without being the mistress of an honorable, progressive man is as good as not understanding the ideas. One has to begin with that is with being your mistress, and the rest will come of itself. You are irritated, Zinaida Fyodorovna, I said. No, I am sincere, she cried, breathing hard. I am sincere. You are sincere, perhaps, but you are in error, and it hurts me to hear you. I am in error? He laughed. Anyone else might say that, but not you, my dear sir. I may seem to you indelicate, cruel, but I don't care. You love me. You love me, don't you? I shrugged my shoulders. Yes, shrug your shoulders. She went on sarcastically. When you were ill, I heard you in your delirium. And ever since these adoring eyes, these sighs, and edifying conversations about friendship, about spiritual kinship. But the point is, why haven't you been sincere? Why have you concealed what is and talked about what isn't? Had you said from the beginning, what ideas exactly led you to drag me from Petersburg? I should have known. I should have poisoned myself then, as I met tea. And there would have been none of this tedious farce. But what's the use of talking? With a wave of the hand, she sat down. You speak to me as though you suspected me of dishonorable intentions. I said, offended. Oh, very well. What's the use of talking? I don't suspect you of intentions, but of having no intentions. And if you had any, I should have known them by now. You had nothing but ideas and love. For the present, ideas and love. And in prospect, me as your mistress. That's in the order of things both in life and in novels. Here you abused him, she said, and she slapped the table with her hand. But one can't help agreeing with him. He has good reasons for despising these ideas. He does not despise ideas. He is afraid of them. I cried. He is a coward and a liar. Oh, very well. He is a coward and a liar, and deceived me. And you? Excuse my frankness. What are you? He deceived me, and left me to take my chance in Petersburg. And you have deceived me, and abandoned me here. But he did not mix up ideas with his deceit, and you. For goodness sake, why are you saying this? I cried in horror, wringing my hands and going up to her quickly. No, Zinaida Fyodorovna, this is cynicism. You must not be so despairing. Listen to me. I went on, catching at a thought which flashed dimly upon me, and which seemed to me might still save us both. Listen! I have passed through so many experiences in my time that my head goes round at the thought of them. And I have realized with my mind, with my racked soul, that man finds his true destiny in nothing, if not in self-sacrificing love for his neighbor. It is towards that we must strive, and that is our destination. That is my faith. I wanted to go on to speak of mercy, of forgiveness, but there was an insincere note in my voice, and I was embarrassed. I want to live. I said genuinely, to live, to live. I want peace, tranquility. I want warmth the sea here to have near. Oh, how I wish one would rouse in you, infro life. You spoke just now of love, but it would be enough for me to have you near, to hear your voice, to watch the look in your face. She flushed crimson, and to hinder my speaking, said quickly, "You love life, and I hate it, so our ways lie apart." She poured herself out some tea, but did not touch it, went into the bedroom, and lay down. "I imagine it is better to cut short this conversation," she said to me from within. "Everything is over for me, and I want nothing." What more is there to say? No, it's not all over. Oh, very well. I know. I am sick of it. That's enough. I got up, took a turn from one end of the room to the other, and went out into the corridor. When late at night, I went to her door and listened. I distinctly heard her crying. Next morning, the waiter, handing me a clothes, informed me with a smile that the lady in number 13 was confined. I dressed somehow, and almost fainting with terror, ran to Zinaida Fyodorovna. In her room, I found a law, a midwife, and an elderly Russian lady from Kharkov, called Darya Mihailovna. There was a smell of ether. I had scarcely crossed the threshold when from the room where she was lying, I heard a low, plaintive moan, and as though it wasn't wafted me by the wind from Russia. And I thought of Orlov, his irony, Polyar, the Neva, the drifting snow, then the cab without an apron, the prediction I had read in the cold morning sky, and the despairing cry, "Nina, Nina!" "Go into her," said the lady. I went in to see Zinaida Fyodorovna, feeling as though I were the father of the child. She was lying with her eyes closed, looking thin and pale, wearing a new white cap edged with lace. I remember there were two expressions on her face. One cold, indifferent, apathetic. The other a look of childish helplessness given her by the white cap. She did not hear me come in, or heard, perhaps, but did not pay attention. I stood, looked at her, and waited, but her face was contorted with pain. She opened her eyes and gazed at the ceiling, as though wondering what was happening to her. There was a look of loathing on her face. "It's horrible," she whispered. "Zinaida Fyodorovna?" I spoke her name softly. She looked at me indifferently, listlessly, and closed her eyes. I stood there a little while, then went away. At night, Darya Mihailovna informed me that the child, a girl, was born, but that the mother was in a dangerous condition. Then I heard noise and bustle in the passage. Darya Mihailovna came to me again, and with a face of despair, wringing her hands, said, "Oh, this is awful. The doctor suspects that she has taken poison." "Oh, how badly Russians do behave here." At 12 o'clock the next day, Zinaida Fyodorovna died. Chapter 36. 2 years had passed. Circumstances had changed. I had come to Petersburg again and could live here openly. I was no longer afraid of being and seeming sentimental, and gave myself up entirely to the fatherly, or rather idolatrous, feeling roused in me by Sonia, Zinaida Fyodorovna's child. I fed her with my own hands, gave her her bath, put her to bed, never took my eyes off her for nights together, and screamed when it seemed to me that the nurse was just going to drop. My thirst for normal, ordinary life became stronger and more acute as time went on. But wider visions stopped short at Sonia, as though I had found in her at last just what I needed. I loved the child madly. In her, I saw the continuation of my life, and it was not exactly that I fancied. But I felt, I almost believed, that when I had cast off at last my long, bony, bearded frame, I should go on living in those little blue eyes, that silky flaxen hair, those dimpled pink hands which stroked my face so lovingly and were clasped round my neck. Sonia's future made me anxious. Orlov was her father. In her birth certificate, she was called Krasnovsky, and the only person who knew of her existence. And took and kissed in her, that is, I was at death's door. I had to think about her seriously. The day after I arrived in Petersburg, I went to see Orlov. The door was opened to me by a stout old fellow with red whiskers and no mustache, who looked like a German. Polya, who was tidying the drawing room, did not recognize me, but Orlov knew me at once. "Ah, Mr. Revolutionist," he said, looking at me with curiosity and laughing. "What fate has brought you?" He was not changed in the least. The same well-groomed, unpleasant face, the same irony. And a new book was lying on the table, just as of old, with an ivory paper knife thrust in it. He had evidently been reading before I came in. He made me sit down, offered me a cigar, and with a delicacy only found in well-bred people, concealing the unpleasant feeling aroused by my face and my wasted figure, observed casually that I was not in the least changed, and that he would have known me anywhere in spite of my having grown a beard. We talked of the weather, of Paris, to dispose as quickly as possible of the oppressive, inevitable question which weighed upon him and me. He asked, "Zinaida Fyodorovna is dead?" "Yes," I answered. "In childbirth?" "Yes, in childbirth." The doctor suspected another cause of death, but it is more comforting for you and for me to think that she died in childbirth. He sighed decorously and was silent. The angel of silence passed over us, as they say. "Yes." And here, everything is as it used to be, no changes, he said briskly, seeing that I was looking about the room. My father, as you know, has left the service and is living in retirement. I am still in the same department. Do you remember Pekarsky? He is just the same as ever. Gruzin died of diphtheria a year ago. Kukushkin is alive and often speaks of you. By the way, said Orlov, dropping his eyes with an air of reserve. When Kukushkin heard who you were, he began telling everyone you had attacked him and tried to murder him, and that he only just escaped with his life. I did not speak. Old servants do not forget their masters. It's very nice of you, said Orlov, jocosely. Will you have some wine and some coffee, though? I will tell them to make some. No, thank you. I've come to see you about a very important matter. Georgy Ivanitch. I am not very fond of important matters, but I shall be glad to be of service to you. What do you want? You see, I began, growing agitated. I have here with me Zinaida Fedorovna's daughter. Hitherto I have brought her up, but, as you see, before many days I shall be an empty sound. I should like to die with the thought that she is provided for. Orlov colored a little, frowned a little, and took a cursory and sullen glance at me. He was unpleasantly affected. Not so much by the important matter as by my word about death, about becoming an empty sound. Yes, it must be thought about, he said, screening his eyes as though from the sun. Thank you. You say it's a girl? Yes, a girl. A wonderful child. Yes. Of course, it's not a lapdog, but a human being. I understand we must consider it seriously. I am prepared to do my part, and I'm very grateful to you. He got up, walked about, biting his nails, and stopped before a picture. We must think about it, he said in a hollow voice, standing with his back to me. I shall go to Pekarsky's today, and will ask him to go to Krasnovsky's. I don't think you will make much ado about consenting to take the child. But excuse me, I don't see what Krasnovsky has got to do with it. I said, also getting up and walking to a picture at the other end of the room. Bechigos's name, of course, said Orlov. Yes, he may be legally obliged to accept the child. I don't know. But I came to you, Georgy Ivanitch, not to discuss the legal aspect. Yes, yes, you are right. He agreed, briskly. I believe I am talking nonsense. But don't excite yourself. We will decide the matter to our mutual satisfaction. If one thing won't do, we'll try another, and if that won't do, we'll try a third one way or another. This delicate question shall be settled. So that's the Pekarsky will arrange it all. Be so good as to leave me your address, and I will let you know at once what we decide. Where are you living? Orlov wrote down my address, sighed, and said with a smile, "Oh Lord, what a job it is to be the father of a little daughter. But Bukarski will arrange it all. He is a sensible man." "Did you stay long in Paris?" 2 months. We were silent. Orlov was evidently afraid I should begin talking of the child again, and to turn my attention in another direction, said, "You have probably forgotten your letter by now, but I have kept it. I understand your mood at the time, and I must own, I respect that letter." Damnable cold blood, Asiatic, coarse laugh that was charming and characteristic. He went on with an ironical smile. "The fundamental thought is perhaps near the truth, though one might dispute the question endlessly. That is," he hesitated, "not dispute the thought itself, but your attitude to the question, your temperament, so to say. Yes, my life is abnormal, corrupted, of no use to anyone. And what prevents me from beginning a new life is cowardice." There you are quite right. But, and you take it so much to heart, are troubled and reduced to despair by it. That's irrational. There you are, quite wrong. And the living man cannot help being troubled and reduced to despair when he sees that he himself is going to ruin, and others are going to ruin round him. Who doubts it? I am not advocating indifference. All I ask for is an objective attitude to life. The more objective, the less danger of falling into error. One must look into the root of things and try to see in every phenomenon a cause of all the other causes. We have grown feeble, slack degraded. In fact, our generation is entirely composed of neurasthenics and whimperers. We do nothing but talk of fatigue and exhaustion. But the fault is neither yours nor mine. We are of too little consequence to affect the destiny of a whole generation. We must suppose for that larger, more general causes with a solid raison d'etre from the biological point of view. We are neurasthenics, flabby renegades, but perhaps it's necessary and of service for generations that will come after us. Not one hair falls from the head without the will of the Heavenly Father, in other words. Nothing happens by chance in nature and in human environment. Everything has its cause and is inevitable. And if so, why should we worry and write despairing letters? That's all very well, I said, thinking a little. I believe it will be easier and clearer for the generations to come. Our experience will be at their service. But one wants to live apart from future generations. And not only for their sake. Life is only given us once, and one wants to live it boldly, with full consciousness and duty. One wants to play a striking, independent, noble part. One wants to make history so that those generations may not have the right to say of each of us that we were non-entities or worse. I believe what is going on about us is inevitable, and not without a purpose. But what have I to do with that inevitability? Why should my ego be lost? Well, there's no help for it, sighed Orlov, getting up and, as it were, giving me to understand that our conversation was over. I took my hat. We've only been sitting here half an hour, and how many questions we have settled. When you come to think of it, said Orlov, seeing me into the hall. So, I will see to that matter. I will see Pekarsky today. Don't be uneasy. He stood waiting while I put on my coat, and was obviously relieved at the feeling that I was going away. Georgy Ivanitch, give me back my letter, I said. Certainly. He went to his study, and a minute later returned with the letter. I thanked him and went away. The next day I got a letter from him. He congratulated me on the satisfactory settlement of the question. Pekarsky nor lady, he wrote, who kept a school, something like a kindergarten, where she took quite little children. The lady could be entirely depended upon. But before concluding anything with her, it would be as well to discuss the matter with Krasnovsky. It was a matter of form. He advised me to see Pekarsky at once, and to take the birth certificate with me, if I had it. Rest assured of the sincere respect and devotion of your humble servant. I read this letter. And Sonia sat on the table and gazed at me attentively, without blinking, as though she knew her fate was being decided. The husband, in the course of the maneuvers, the N Cavalry Regiment halted for a night at the district town of K. Such an event as the visit of officers always has the most exciting and inspiring effect on the inhabitants. A shopkeeper's dream of getting rid of the rusty sausages and best brand sardines that had been lying for 10 years on their shelves the inns. In restaurants, keep open all night, the military commandant, his secretary, and the local garrison put on their best uniforms. The police flit to and fro like mad, while the effect on the ladies is beyond all description. The ladies of K, hearing the regiment approaching, forsook their pans of boiling jam and ran into the street. Forgetting their mourning, deshabille, and general untidiness, they rushed breathless with excitement to meet the regiment and listened greedily to the band playing the march. Looking at their pale, ecstatic faces, one might have thought those strains came from some heavenly choir rather than from the military brass band. The regiment, they cried joyfully. The regiment is coming. What could this unknown regiment that came by chance today, and would depart at dawn tomorrow mean to them? Afterwards, when the officers were standing in the middle of the square and with their hands behind them discussing the question of billets, all the ladies were gathered together at the examining magistrates and vying with one another in their criticisms of the regiment. They already knew, goodness knows how, that the colonel was married, but not living with his wife, that the senior officer's wife had a baby born dead every year, that the adjutant was hopelessly in love with some countess and had even once attempted suicide. They knew everything. When a pockmarked soldier in a red shirt darted past the windows, they knew for certain that it was Lieutenant Renzov's orderly running about the town, trying to get some English bitter ale on tick for his master. They had only caught a passing glimpse of the officers' backs, but had already decided that there was not one handsome or interesting man among them. Having talked to their heart's content, they sent for the military commandant and the committee of the club and instructed them at all costs to make arrangements for a dance. Their wishes were carried out. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the military band was playing in the street before the club, while in the club itself, the officers were dancing with the ladies of K. The ladies felt as though they were on wings. Intoxicated by the dancing, the music, and the clank of spurs, they threw themselves heart and soul into making the acquaintance of their new partners, and quite forgot their old civilian friends. Their fathers and husbands, forced temporarily into the background, crowded round the meager refreshment table in the entrance hall. All these government cashiers, secretaries, clerks, and superintendents, stale, sickly-looking, clumsy figures, were perfectly well aware of their inferiority. They did not even enter the ballroom, but contented themselves with watching their wives and daughters in the distance, dancing with the accomplished and graceful officers. Among the husbands was Shalikov, the tax collector, a narrow, spiteful soul, given to drink, with a big, closely cropped head and thick, protruding lips. He had had a university education. There had been a time when he used to read progressive literature and sing student songs. But now, as he said of himself, he was a tax collector and nothing more. He stood leaning against the doorpost, his eyes fixed on his wife, Anna Pavlovna, a little brunette of 30, with a long nose and a pointed chin. Tightly laced, with her face carefully powdered, she danced without pausing for breath, danced till she was ready to drop exhausted. But though she was exhausted in body, her spirit was inexhaustible. One could see as she danced that her thoughts were with the past. That faraway past when she used to dance at the college for young ladies, dreaming of a life of luxury and gaiety, and never doubting that her husband was to be a prince, or at the worst, a baron. The tax collector watched, scowling with spite. It was not jealousy he was feeling. He was ill-humored first, because the room was taken up with dancing. And there was nowhere he could play a game of cards. Secondly, because he could not endure the sound of wind instruments. And thirdly, because he fancied the officers treated the civilians somewhat too casually and disdainfully. But what above everything revolted him and moved him to indignation was the expression of happiness on his wife's face. It makes me sick to look at her, he muttered. Going on for 40, and nothing to boast of at any time. And she must powder her face and lace herself up, spread and frizzing her hair, flirting and making faces and fancying she's doing a thing instead. Ah, you're a pretty figure. Upon my soul. Anna Pavlovna was so lost in the dance that she did not once glance at her husband. Of course not. Where do we poor country bumpkins come in? Sneered the tax collector. We are at a discount now. We're clumsy seals, unpolished provincial bears, and she's the queen of the bow. She has kept enough of her looks to please even officer. They'd not object to making love to her, I dare say. During the mazurka, the tax collector's face twitched with spite. A black-haired officer with prominent eyes and tartar cheekbones danced the mazurka with Anna Pavlovna. Assuming a stern expression, he worked his legs with gravity and feeling, and so crooked his knees that he looked like a jack-a-dandy pulled by strings, while Anna Pavlovna, pale and thrilled, bending her figure languidly and turning her eyes up, tried to look as though she scarcely touched the floor, and evidently felt herself that she was not on earth, not at the local club, but somewhere far, far away in the clouds. Not only her face, but her whole figure was expressive of beatitude. The tax collector could endure it no longer. He felt a desire to jeer at that beatitude, to make Anna Pavlovna feel that she had forgotten herself, that life was by no means so delightful as she fancied now in her excitement. You wait. I'll teach you to smile so blissfully, he muttered. You're not a boarding school miss. You're not a girl. An old fright ought to realize she is a fright. Petty feelings of envy, vexation, wounded vanity, of the small provincial misanthropy engendered in petty officials by vodka and a sedentary life, swarmed in his heart like mice. Waiting for the end of the mazurka, he went into the hall and walked up to his wife. Anna Pavlovna was sitting with her partner and flirting her fan and coquettishly dropping her eyelids, was describing how she used to dance in Petersburg. Her lips were pursed up like a rosebud, and she pronounced it home in Petersburg. Anyuta, Let's go home, croaked the tax collector, seeing her husband standing before her. Anna Pavlovna started as though recalling the fact that she had a husband. Then she flushed all over. She felt ashamed that she had such a sickly-looking, ill-humored, ordinary husband. "Let us go home," repeated the tax collector. "Why? It's quite early." "I beg you to come home," said the tax collector deliberately, with a spiteful expression. "Why? Has anything happened?" Anna Pavlovna asked in a flutter. "Nothing has happened, but I wish you to go home at once." "I wish it. That's enough. And without further talk, please." Anna Pavlovna was not afraid of her husband, but she felt ashamed on account of her partner, who was looking at her husband with surprise and amusement. She got up and moved a little apart with her husband. "What notion is this?" she began. "Why, go home." "Why? It's not 11 o'clock. I wish it, and that's enough. Come along, and that's all about it. Don't be silly. Go home alone if you want to. Right. Then I shall make a scene." The tax collector saw the look of beatitude gradually vanish from his wife's face, saw how ashamed and miserable she was, and he felt a little happier. "Why do you want me at once?" asked his wife. "I don't want you, but I wish you to be at home. I wish it, that's all." At first, Anna Pavlovna refused to hear of it. Then she began entreating her husband to let her stay just another half hour then, without knowing why. She began to apologize, to protest, and all in a whisper, with a smile, that the spectators might not suspect that she was having a tiff with her husband. She began assuring him she would not stay long, only another 10 minutes, only 5 minutes. But the tax collector stuck obstinately to his point. "Stay if you like," he said, "but I'll make a scene if you do." And as she talked to her husband, Anna Pavlovna looked thinner, older, plainer, pale, biting her lips, and almost crying. She went out to the entry and began putting on her things. "Talking? You are not going?" asked the ladies in surprise. "Anna Pavlovna, you're not going, dear." "Her head aches," said the tax collector for his wife. Coming out of the club, the husband and wife walked all the way home in silence. The tax collector walked behind his wife, and watching her downcast, sorrowful, humiliated little figure, he recalled the look of beatitude which had so irritated him at the club, and the consciousness that the beatitude was gone filled his soul with triumph. He was pleased and satisfied, and at the same time, he felt the lack of something. He would have liked to go back to the club and make everyone feel dreary and miserable, so that all might know how stale and worthless life is when you walk along the streets in the dark and hear the slush of the mud under your feet. And when you know that you will wake up next morning with nothing to look forward to but vodka and cards. Oh, how awful it is. And Anna Pavlovna could scarcely walk. She was still under the influence of the dancing, the music, the talk, the lights, and the noise. She asked herself as she walked along why God had thus afflicted her. She felt miserable, insulted, and choking with hate as she listened to her husband's heavy footsteps. She was silent, trying to think of the most offensive, biting, and venomous word she could hurl at her husband. And at the same time, she was fully aware that no word could penetrate her tax collector's hide. What did he care for words? Her bitterest enemy could not have contrived for her a more helpless position. And meanwhile, the band was playing, and the darkness was full of the most rousing, intoxicating dance tunes.